So, is the stage being set for the prophecy of Zechariah 12:3 as we speak? It looks like it. If you are blessed and are learning from this channel, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and give us a thumbs up. Having been a follower of Yeshua for 37 years, I have often heard and even said myself that we are in the last days. To be sure, even first century believers thought that they were in the last days. And each day that passes puts us closer to the end of God's program for mankind on this side of eternity. So when people hear that we are in the last days, many of them suffering from some sort of eschatological fatigue roll their eyes and move on. Are those of us claiming that it is 11:59 at the 11th hour just sensationalists? Are we overreacting and directing our focus on the less important at the expense of what matters in life the most? Frankly, it all depends on what our focus is being redirected to. I've always been a very literal, context-driven student of God's Word. If God left us the Bible as His message to us on how to live and what to look forward to, we can look at it from different cultural vantage points, but we must agree that it contains the same truth for all mankind. We might not like some of the statements that the Bible makes, but that doesn't give us the authority to declare that they are not the truth. When we survey God's counsel, we are bound to find many prophecies fulfilled and more yet to be fulfilled. We must resist newspaper exegesis, but we need to honestly look at the news through a biblical lens if we want to know where we are on God's timeline of human history. Much of that timeline revolves around Israel and Jerusalem, as God has promised to never forsake Israel or allow for its destruction, as we can read in Jeremiah 31:35 through 37. At a time when rockets are raining down on Israel by the hundreds, from a human perspective, the situation looks very bleak. While casualties are inevitable on both sides, God isn't caught by surprise by the present conflict, and neither should those of us who take His word seriously. Satan's demise is coming. It's coming quickly, and he's desperate. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and Satan finds in most of the world a plethora of willing executioners for his anti-Semitic agenda. Truth has long ceased to matter. Fact checks are politically or socially motivated. This is the world we live in. If someone believes that they are contributing to social justice, multiculturalism, and tolerance, they immediately feel like they are making a difference to improve the world we live in. And they might, to an extent. Even if it is at the expense of someone else, and in this case, as it too often is the case, at the expense of Israel and the Jewish people. Not long after the tragedy of the Hyper Cacher supermarket on the east side of Paris in 2015, Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a piece in The Atlantic that still resonates in my head. In it, he made a sobering statement that I was really hoping was inaccurate, but as it turns out, he might have been spot on. And he wrote, and I quote, "The Shoah served for a while as a sort of inoculation against the return of overt Jew hatred, but the effects of the inoculation, it is becoming clear, are wearing off. What was once impermissible is again imaginable. Memories of 6 million Jewish dead fade, and guilt becomes burdensome. Israel is coming to be understood not as a small country in a difficult spot whose leaders, especially lately, have been making short-sighted and potentially disastrous decisions, but as a source of cosmological evil, the Jew of nations." Wow, powerful quote. What Goldberg saw 6 years ago was the erosion of Europe's compassion towards the Jewish people. And it's coming to America. I have long been a believer that what happens in Europe, and even particularly in France, is a good indication of what is coming to America. The barometer of the new antisemitism in Europe sets the temperature for what is coming to our country here in America. Since 1948, when Israel was reborn as a modern nation, anti-Semitism, which was localized mostly to Greater Europe, became a global virus. The tiny Jewish state gave anti-Semites a justification for a Jew hatred that has now spread over the four corners of the world. The irrational conclusion has been that if Israel is guilty, by proxy, all Jews are as well. This could lead to the whole world hating the Jews. Wait, isn't there a prophecy in the Bible about that? Of course there is, more than one. The prophet Zechariah wrote, and I quote, "Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the people. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it." That's in Zechariah 12, verses 2 and 3. Mind you, this is a reference to the campaign of Armageddon, and we're not there since this will be taking place during the final stretch of the Great Tribulation. And we read about it in Revelation 16:16 or 19:19. Yet we cannot afford to put our heads in the sand and ignore the signs of the times. None of this final chapter of mankind, hinging around Israel, is going to happen in a vacuum, but rather it will be progressive and exponential. I believe that we are well on the way to that final biblical curtain call as the pressure is mounting against the Jews worldwide. Just look at this. Just in the last week, in a recent conversation with the Pope, Turkish President Erdogan declared, and I quote, "All of humanity should be united against Israel," close quote. I wonder if he had any idea of how biblical he was when he made that outrageous statement. All of humanity should be united against Israel. Can you believe this? Pro-Palestinian crowds gathered in Los Angeles and attacked Jewish diners as a result of the conflict in Gaza for the last couple of weeks between Hamas and Israel. Pro-Palestinian crowds also rallied in Westwood, California, demanding that Israel stops the airstrikes over the Gaza Strip. Notice that they did not ask for a ceasefire or for an end to the conflict, just that Israel would stop defending itself. This is ludicrous. In New York, Jewish people were attacked by pro-Palestinian passing cars who threw fireworks at them, screaming, "Effing Zionist." One Jewish person actually got burned. In Germany, people marched on the streets shouting, "Free Palestine from the Jordan to the sea," which technically is a euphemism for "get rid of all the Jews." In London, in England, a group of cars drove through a Jewish neighborhood screaming, "F the Jews, rape their daughters." In Washington, D.C., protesters gathered outside the Israeli embassy and shouted, "Free, free Palestine," and declared that Israel had no right to exist. That's all in the last week. As of this program, Egypt brokered a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, and I hope it holds. It's uncertain if that ceasefire will really hold, but what is sure is that the hatred for Israel and the Jewish people seems to continue to grow on the global scale, regardless of the ceasefire, preparing the way for an all-out war against the Jews. The Bible is clear, my friends. At some point, all the nations of the world will gather against Jerusalem, but that does not mean that all people will follow suit. It is time for all Christians and people of goodwill to unite in rebellion against the real oppressor. For the last several decades, under the leadership of the new anti-Semitism, the Jews became the perpetrators, something that they never have been. Now it is time, right now, to reset our moral GPS, because nobody in his right mind will find any moral equivalence between a country that uses weapons to defend its civilian and a group of people who uses civilians to hide their weapons. Maybe the days of Zechariah 12:3 are closer than we think.